Hello, welcome back. In our last lesson, we saw our first or two deaths in the play and really building toward that tragic form for the tragic ending of the play. What I want to talk about this time is a little bit about cause and effect, because in a tragedy, we know that we have to have things that are probable, not merely possible. For a comedy, there's possibility, but for tragedy, probability. So we need to talk about the cause and effect here. The things that happen in the play, the death of Mercutio and the death of Tybalt, are these believable? Could this have happened? The play starts to ask questions about cause and effect. What caused one thing to happen? For the death of Tybalt and Mercutio, we could ask, was it merely a misunderstanding? But the play also offers another idea, which is kind of interesting. It's on line Act 3, at the very beginning of Act 3, line 4, where it says, "For now these hot days is the mad blood stirring." It could be something so simple that it's in July and it's very hot outside. But think about that a little bit. It's not just the heat, it's the idea of nature. Is it something in human nature that brought about these violent acts? Is that what it is? And quickly following Romeo's killing of Tybalt, we can jump ahead here to talk about this cause and effect. When Juliet finds out the news, she too begins to wonder about the cause and effect. This happens in the following scene, scene 2, around lines 105 or so. And she starts to go through cause and effect. My husband lives, that Tybalt would have slain, and Tybalt's dead, that would have slain my husband. Wherefore should I weep then? Some word there was that murdered me. And then she says further on, that one word is the word banishment. Now, is that the idea of the cause? And it might be, because we see in line 75 of the same scene that she is talking about the serpent. And what she's referring to here, the serpent heart hid with the flowering face. She's talking about the serpent from the Garden of Eden. So think of that word banishment. If you know a little bit about the story of Garden of Eden, it's that Adam and Eve were in the garden, and God said, "Don't eat from the tree of knowledge." Then there's a serpent in the tree, entices Eve, take from the fruit, she eats it, and then she goes and gives it to Adam. This angers God, and he banishes them from the Garden of Eden. Now, is that the cause of the violence in this play, our original banishment from the Garden of Eden? Or there's another idea of what has caused it as well. When we go to the idea for Romeo, who's thinking about what has happened as well, he says, is it some part of the name that's in my anatomy? This is in the following scene around line 106, where he's talking about, as if that name, in what vile part of this anatomy doth my name lodge? This is going back to a theme I've talked about, the idea of names or written language. Is it something that comes from history? Is it the history of man, a history of violence that has led to the death of Mercutio and Tybalt here? In other words, we're wondering about what is the cause and effect. Now, the play doing this, I think, is adding to the tragic elements because it has to be probable, believable. And me, I believe that what happens in the play could have happened. Misunderstandings, the heat, the banishment, histories of violence, all of these things are actually the cause. Okay, let's step back to right after Romeo has killed Tybalt and Mercutio has died. Right after this scene, the prince arrives. And earlier the prince was, in Act 1, this violence in the streets, it must stop. And here we have a parallel scene where the prince shows up after violence in the streets, except this time people have actually died. And on line 152 or so, Benvolio goes through this long monologue where he just says what happened. He explains it all to the prince. I think this marks the beginning of what we could call sort of a mock trial. Benvolio, in that sense, he's an eyewitness, and he's reporting in the trial to the prince, who's the judge. Here's what happened, an eyewitness account. Right after he speaks with his eyewitness account, because he actually did see what happened, and what he says is accurate, then Lady Capulet, she kind of takes the stand to give her testimony. But her testimony is a false testimony. She says, Some 20 of them fought in this black strife, and all those 20 could but kill one life. We know that's not true. There weren't 20 people. It was Romeo, Benvolio, Mercutio, and Tybalt, 4 people. Lady Capulet wasn't even there. This is false testimony. Following her speaking, Montague speaks, Romeo's father. And we could think of him as speaking in Romeo's defense in this mock trial. And his defense is that he speaks about Romeo's motivation, which is something we do in a murder trial. What was his motive for committing this crime? And Montague says, "Not Romeo, Prince, he was Mercutio's friend. His fault concludes, but what the law should end." In other words, Tybalt killed Mercutio, and that was the motivation for Romeo to attack Tybalt. Then the final part of this mock trial is the prince speaks, and like a judge, he gives his verdict. But the verdict is not the death sentence. Instead, the verdict is exile or banishment. I think that's an interesting way to read the scene, is to read it as kind of a mock trial. Right after this mock trial, we go to scene 2, and it's Juliet. And Juliet doesn't know what's going on yet, and she's waiting for Romeo. Remember, they just got married that morning. It's their wedding night. They need to, and want to, consummate this wedding, consummate this marriage. And she calls out for the night to come, multiple times. "Come, civil night, gallop apace. Come night, come Romeo, come thou, day and night." She's ready for him to come. But of course, the sad thing is that he will not be coming, that he's been banished. And the nurse comes, and she informs Juliet of this. And this is one of those things we call anagnorisis, a point of discovery, where she realizes he's been banished. Now, I love where she learns of the banishment and how she and the nurse speak about it. If you look at just the exclamation points and just the punctuation marks on the end of the sentences, this starts around line 90. Line 90, you'll see exclamation point, and then "for such a whoosh," exclamation point, and then the nurse with a question mark, and a question mark, and a question mark from Juliet, and a question mark from Juliet, and another question, and then exclamation point. If we go to the next page, we have question, exclamation, question, question, exclamation, exclamation. We have this series of questions and a series of exclamatory remarks, really building the tension in the play. And it builds more rapidly because in the next scene, scene 3, it's Romeo. And you'll notice that Romeo speaks in the same structure. If we look at just the punctuation marks, the exclamations and the questions, in line 4 of scene 3, "What news? What is the prince's doom? I yet know not." Question, question, question. Another question, exclamation point. If we go into the next page, we'll see more series of question marks followed by exclamation points. The same structure of the previous scene. And if we go to Juliet in the previous scene again, we'll find another parallel. If you remember, earlier in the play, Romeo was speaking of, brawling love. Remember the use of oxymorons, these opposites? Look at Juliet in Act 3, Scene 2, when she finds out Romeo is banished. She uses the same kind of language as Romeo. This is around line 73 that I mentioned earlier with the serpent. And she says, "Beautiful tyrant, fiend angelical, dove-feathered raven, wolfish ravening lamb, despised substance of divinest show, damned saint, honorable villain," oxymoron, 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 as well as the use of questions, exclamations by Romeo and Juliet. In this way, we can think of how their response to what happened is shown through their language, but their language is parallel. And in that way, we can see that Romeo and Juliet are not married yet physically, but they're married through their language and the way they speak. Okay, let's pause there, and we'll pick it up in the next lesson.